Good morning, everyone. My name is Egypt Lord, and thank you for joining us today for our June coalition meeting. We are so excited to have our guest speaker, Gloria Widener, that will be speaking to you here in just a few minutes. I would like to welcome our national and international guests this morning. But before I get started in introducing our presenter, I will hand it over to our lead coordinator, Naomi Gordon, who will tell you our announcements. Naomi?
Hi, good morning, everyone. What a turnout today. So happy to see some familiar as well as new faces. And as I make the announcements, feel free to drop in the chat any announcements that you have on your end, as well if you're joining us for the first time, introducing yourself as well. So first, I'd like you to please join me in congratulating Marika Van Dam on her 10-year anniversary as Executive Director of History Cambridge. And I'll pull up a photo of her celebration this past Friday. Very cute. So in addition to her leadership in modernizing the organization, Marika has been a vital supporter of the coalition as both an advisor and our fiscal sponsor. So many congratulations. I also want to highlight another important milestone that took place this Sunday. So King's Chapel in Boston held a groundbreaking and blessing ceremony for a new statue memorializing the 219 people enslaved by ministers and members of the congregation. This is part of their continued efforts to confront and honor that legacy. The statue will be officially unveiled during a community dedication on September 14th. So be sure to mark your calendars. And then I have several upcoming events as well. So I'll scroll through here. And can everybody see the newsletter up on my screen?
Not at the
Just
moment.
not the moment, just the image of.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so for upcoming events, actually tomorrow, our Partnership of Historic Bostons will be hosting an online talk titled Suing Slavery, Freedom Suits in the 18th Century Essex County. Historian Jean Pickering will explore the legal battles where 21 enslaved people sued for their freedom and won, helping reshape the definition of freedom in Massachusetts. And again, that talk will be online. And this Thursday, join Hidden Brookline and other partners for the final talk of the Speaking from the Heart series.
It's
Civil rights.
Saturday, not
Oh,
Thursday.
Saturday. Thank you, Barbara. And Barbara's part of Hidden Brookline. And so that'll be Saturday at 2 p.m. Civil rights advocate and former state representative Byron Rushing will speak on memory, remembering on purpose, forgetting on purpose, and this will be at the Brookline Public Library. Then on Monday, June 16th at 6 p.m., Marcus Rediker will speak on his book, Freedom Ship, The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea. He'll shed light on the thousands who escaped bondage by sea with help from sailors, dock workers, and market women. This will also be online with American ancestors. And again, any links to these events can be found in our newsletter. And then Sunday, June 22nd, from 12:30 to 3, join us at 105 Brattle Street in Cambridge for Longfellow House's annual Juneteenth gathering. Now in its fourth year, this free family-friendly event features poetry, music, historical displays, and more. So the coalition will have a booth. I believe History Cambridge will also have a booth. So be sure to come by and say hello. And finally, on Tuesday, June 24th, at 6 p.m., the Massachusetts Historical Society is hosting an event with historian Kelly Carter Jackson. She'll be discussing her new book, We Refuse, which explores the powerful history of Black resistance, especially the role of Black women in shaping freedom movements across generations. I had the opportunity to hear her speak at the Boston Athenaeum and highly recommend if you have the opportunity to go see her. So that just wraps it up for my announcements. And with that, I'll pass it back to Egypt to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you. Great job. So today we are so excited to have our good friend, Gloria Wyden. And if you haven't read her bio in its entirety, I highly recommend. I do request that everyone mute themselves during her presentation. After her presentation, as Naomi stated earlier, feel free to enter your questions in the chat. Gloria will get to as many questions as she can. And of course, you can also utilize the reaction, raise your hand up button as well. So without further ado, a little bit about our honored speaker today, Gloria Wyden. She is E. Gordon Fox Assistant Professor of History at UW-Madison, where she has received numerous teaching awards for her courses on slavery, the biography, The American Revolution, Colonial North America, and the Atlantic World. She earned her PhD at Harvard University and her BA at Rice University. Her work has been published in the Journal of American History, the Journal of Early Republic, the Journal of Social History, and Commonplace. And she is currently completing a book titled Belonging, An Intimate History of Family and Slavery in Early New England, which is under contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press. So without further ado, please welcome Miss Gloria Wyden.
Well, hello. I'm just going to share my screen with all of you because I have a visual I'd like to be able to scroll through. All right. Well, I would like to start. Thank you, Egypt. I'd like to start by thanking all of you at the Enslaved Legacy History Coalition for inviting me to share about my book today, and really for just doing the important work that you are doing month in and month out with spreading awareness, building knowledge, encouraging good and thoughtful work and engagement with our past, our shared past. I would especially like to thank Dennis Lloyd, Egypt Lloyd, Naomi Gordon, and Joyce Jones. And it's just such a privilege to be here with all of you today. So my book is titled Belonging, An Intimate History of Slavery and Family in Early New England. And it's published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, as Egypt mentioned. And you can actually obtain it. Oh, there we go. You can obtain it at a 40% discount if you order it by June 20th using the code pen-summer25 on the University of Pennsylvania Press website. All author royalties get directed into a scholarship fund that I set up alongside Dennis and Egypt, which is called the Darby Vassal Fund for the Study of Slavery. So I feel completely uninhibited in encouraging you all to purchase the book. I won't earn a penny, but this important scholarship fund will grow. And I do hope that you like the book and would be happy to hear from you about it, should you have the chance to give it a read. But about belonging. So I'm a historian in large part because I love stories. So I wanted to tell stories in my book. Therefore, each chapter of Belonging tells the story of an enslaved family or a cluster of bound kin. They're not always formally recognized as a family, but in certain instances, essentially serve as a family. So each chapter tells the story of an enslaved family, even as it explores a broader set of issues related to family life, the family life of people in bondage. So for instance, One chapter is about childhood in slavery. And in that chapter, I tell the story of a girl named Sue who grew up in slavery. And then I also tell the stories of the children she eventually bore as an adult who also grew up in slavery. Another chapter is about the marriages of people in bondage. And I tell the story of a man named Sebastian and a woman named Jane who worked hard to secure a formal marriage and then raised a number of children in Boston. So since stories are what made me a historian, and since stories sort of provide the narrative trajectory of my book, each chapter sort of follows one of these family narratives, I wanted to start off today with just a little story. So this is a story that comes toward the end of my book. It'll probably be a little bit familiar to a few of you and new to others. And it's a story that is very important to me because it prompted me to rethink what I thought I knew about the way slavery ended in the state of Massachusetts. So after I tell this story, I will share some clues from the archive that I dug up when I was trying to make sense of the story. And then finally, at the end of my little chat with you today, I will connect the story and what it reveals about Boston to my book, what it reveals about revolutionary Boston in a particular moment. I'll connect the story and what it reveals about revolutionary Boston to my book more broadly. So, for the story. In early summer 1775, a small figure moved across the landscape of eastern Massachusetts. Darby Vassall, a black child who had been born into slavery 6 years before, walked from Woburn to Medford to Charlestown to Cambridge. At every turn, he encountered signs of war. Homes plundered by the British, tree limbs blasted by stray bullets, stone walls toppled by colonial snipers. The very air that hung around him, hot and heavy as a blanket, was punctured by the sound of artillery. Along the way, Darby likely crossed paths with refugees who had escaped from British-occupied Boston. Refugees who brought with them nothing more than the clothes on their backs and tales of deprivation. For more than 10 miles, the boy, just 6 years old, pushed on through destruction before arriving at his destination, the Cambridge mansion where his birth family had long been enslaved. Another person arrived on the premises soon after Darby. George Washington, the Virginia enslaver who had recently been named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Darby was supposedly at play, swinging on the gate, guarding the way to the stately home when he first met George. Watching Darby on that gate, guarding the way to the stately home, watching Darby on that gate, the towering enslaver saw a child who needed a task with which to occupy himself. George therefore instructed the boy to go inside, where they would tell him what to do and give him something to eat. But Darby did not follow the general's orders. Instead, the child asked how much his wages would be. The commander-in-chief was taken aback. How could Darby be so unreasonable at such a time as to expect to be paid? But the 6-year-old did not consider the demand unreasonable at all, for, as the story goes, he was feeling the value of his freedom. This snippet of a story connecting Darby and George is one of countless bits of antiquarian lore surrounding the wartime experiences of the first president of the United States. There are reasons to discount it. We don't even know who told this story, for instance, and it was not written down in the historical record until nearly a century after it supposedly took place. Even more important, as I thought when I first read this story simply doesn't make sense. Why would this little boy who had never been emancipated by his enslaver believe himself to be free in the year 1775? like all historians of New England, I knew that bondspeople in Massachusetts were liberated nearly a decade later, after a 1783 court case in which a man named Quock Walker was found to be free on the basis of the state's 1780 Constitution. This Constitution declared that all men were free and equal. But Darby's encounter with the general took place well before that court case took place. It took place well before the Constitution was passed or even written. The story must somehow have gotten scrambled. But Darby's story and many other anecdotes I came across as I did research fit so poorly with historians' explanations of emancipation in Massachusetts that I decided to test in the archive what we scholars thought we knew. The first place I turned was probate court. Probate court processed the wills written by people who had passed away, and it took inventories of their property. Probate court records are useful because in wills and in inventories, white people claimed ownership of enslaved people more clearly than just about anywhere else. I was astonished by what I found. Before the Revolution, probate records show that the system of slavery in the region was relatively robust. This didn't surprise me. But from 1775 on, wills bequeathing human property all but disappeared, and bound laborers of African descent pretty much vanished from white people's inventories. What is more, the 1780 Constitution and the 1783 judicial decision influenced the rates of slaveholding in eastern Massachusetts? Not at all. There appears to have been no impact. This probate evidence ran so directly counter to the accepted interpretation of abolition in Massachusetts that I decided I had to look somewhere else. Could I find other sources that corroborated the findings? Would other sources show this crumbling of slavery before scholars had expected it to crumble? So I decided to read through petitions. Thousands of petitions were submitted to Massachusetts officials in the early years of the Revolution, and some of these documents are fascinating. Some of them provide insight into the ways in which Black people assess the opportunities and the risks of wartime life in Massachusetts. So consider, for example, the case of a man named Joseph Johnson. Joseph had been captured at sea, and he was living in Boston. This is the early moments of the Revolution. He was living in Boston when he petitioned. But even though he was, as he called himself, a free Negro man, Joseph sensed that his autonomy was vulnerable. He wasn't worried about being enslaved in Boston, however. Joseph feared enslavement elsewhere. He had been, as he put it, threatened to be sold and sent to Albany as a slave. A different petition elaborates on the same point. Cuba, a 25-year-old woman of African descent, was captured by an American warship and brought to Boston in the year 1777. Again, this is the early years of the Revolution. Once there, as Cuba put it, she rejoiced that she had been brought to this land of liberty. It was a place where she expected to spend her life in comfort and freedom, but she, like Joseph, feared being sent away. Cuba claimed that an officer on board the ship that captured her planned to have her sold as a slave and sent to Jamaica. The officer pledged to carry out his scheme in spite of all courts and persons whatsoever, which reveals his expectation that he would need to counter both the local justice system and the local populace if he were going to send the woman away from Boston. Court records provide additional evidence that local white people were questioning slavery in the early years of the Revolution. and that white inhabitants were realizing that they might not be able to claim the lives and labors of Black people much longer. So, for example, in the year 1777, a man named Cato, who was described as an African by birth, arranged for a Boston man named Samuel Conant to be hauled into court for attempting to sell him, the said Cato, as a slave and transport him to foreign parts. The arrest warrant suggests that local white people were looking to offload the enslaved to places with more robust systems of slavery. And it suggests as well that the Massachusetts justice system took seriously the claims of Black inhabitants who were victimized in the process. Cato, who feared foreign parts, like Cuba, who was terrified of Jamaica, and Joseph, who dreaded passage to Albany, appealed to local authorities in an attempt to keep himself in a place where the system of slavery was caving in around him. So, probate records, petitions, court records, all these records show that at least in the eastern part of Massachusetts, slavery essentially petered out in the 1770s during the early years of the Revolution. This evidence and a lot more actually moves the timeline of slavery's end in the region. And the movement's really important because it indicates that the mechanism for ending slavery in the region is actually different from what historians have long assumed. If most Black people in the area obtained their liberty before the political and legal developments that supposedly ended slavery in the state, the emancipatory process must have been a bottom-up rather than a top-down revolution. That is, the end of slavery must have been fueled by the internal dynamics of slaveholding households, more than it was fueled by changes that were enacted by prominent citizens like delegates to the Constitutional Convention, lawyers, court justices, or the men who served on juries in the courts. This vision of emancipation runs counter to the past century of historical scholarship on the matter, but it's not really new. It actually echoes arguments made over 200 years ago by Jeremy Belknap, who was the first historian to study the end of slavery in Massachusetts. Slavery, Jeremy concluded, had been abolished, not by the Constitution, nor by the courts, but by public opinion. As I did more research, it became clear to me that Black activists understood the power of public opinion, and they put forth great effort to shape it during this period. Surviving print records show this most clearly. In 1773, people of African descent, including people actively in slavery, launched a powerful abolitionist campaign that was supposedly aimed at lawmakers. It was in part, but it's clear that it was intended every bit as much to sway the hearts and the minds of their neighbors. So their first appeal, which circulated Boston and the larger region as a tract, was promoted in a Boston newspaper, and it was advertised by a local printer. 3 months later, bound men, so men who were actively in slavery, they went about writing another petition, and they sent it to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. They managed to get this petition appended or attached to one of the most popular political treatises written during the Revolutionary era. So it circulated in great numbers. 2 months later, enslaved Bostonians asked their lawmakers again for the abolition of slavery, and they persuaded a local newspaper to print the full text of their request across its front page. 3 weeks after that, an unidentified bondsman sent a condemnation of slavery to a Boston newspaper. A similar statement written by a quote unquote son of Africa was printed in another Boston paper, and a third such appeal occupied nearly all of the cover page of the Essex Journal, which circulated just north of Boston. The region's Black activists did not let up. In January of 1774, enslaved Bostonians sent yet another petition to their lawmakers. Once again, local newspapers picked up the story, bringing the petitioners' words into public houses and meeting houses, courtrooms, and bedrooms. In May of that year, the petitioners addressed the House of Representatives again. And soon after, they sent yet another plea to Massachusetts lawmakers, once more making sure that the text of their complaint was broadcast in print to their community. Placed in the first column of the front page of a prominent newspaper, the entreaty could not be missed. If you, my listeners, are exhausted by this laundry list of Black protest in print, that's kind of the point. The appeals simply kept coming during these pre-revolutionary years. The printers kept printing, the public kept reading. Now, the legislature never abolished slavery, at least in part because the governor dissolved the general court in the midst of the petition drive. This was related to this conflict that was building between Britain and the colonies on the eve of the revolution. But the petitioners, who made their claims so evident to everybody to a great portion of the region, the petitioners won their broader point. Smothered by the claims of Black activists, white Bostonians appear to have become convinced that their claims to human property were not legitimate. But how? On what grounds did Boston's enslaved community make illegitimate, long-held beliefs and long-practiced customs? How did they accomplish this? The answer has everything to do with the subject of my book. Families. Black families figure prominently in this robust body of protest literature. Literature that moved through the region in newspapers, in tracts, in manuscripts, in circular letters, in oral recitations, and in rumors. Enslaved activists depicted slavery not just as a crime against the individual, but also as a crime against the family. We are deprived of everything that has a tendency to make life even tolerable, the petitioners wrote. The endearing ties of husband, wife, parent, child, and friend we are generally strangers to. And whenever any of those connections are formed among us, the pleasures are embittered by the cruel consideration of our slavery. The petitioners used repetition strategically to hammer home their point. Their next appeal reiterated the complaint nearly word for word and went on to provide specific examples of familial destruction wrought by practices of slaveholding in Massachusetts. Another petition laid out precisely the same scenarios. Slavery compromised family integrity in a whole host of disturbing ways, and bound activists highlighted in petition after petition the damage caused by these disruptions to their intimate lives. In order for us to understand how these arguments about families could bring about real change in this time and place, we need to understand Black family life in Eastern Massachusetts, which is the central objective of my book. As belonging shows, these arguments about families were particularly powerful because they built on a long-standing set of historical realities. The Black community in the region had a long track record of building faithful families against all odds. Evidence of the family ties of bondspeople was everywhere in 18th century Massachusetts. In just the town of Boston, for instance, more than 1,000 Black people were married by ministers and justices of the peace over the course of the 18th century. These Bostonians put forth great effort to establish their marital ties in public and to wed in an official capacity. So these weren't kind of private marriages that happened outside the public eye. The process of obtaining a legal marriage involved town clerks, ministers, justices of the peace, and the broader community. which vetted the relationships of Black people and white people and had the potential to forbid from marrying any couples who were deemed unsuitable. Now, if enslaved people married in great numbers, so too did they bear children. The fragmented records of Boston's churches indicate that hundreds of enslaved and free Black children were baptized before Boston's congregations over the course of the 18th century. This was a ritual that was ordinarily carried out by the minister with the aid of the child's father. Baptisms were performed in the same place where marriages were announced, in Boston's local churches, which stood at the center of Boston's social life, and which residents of all races were required by law to attend. Because enslaved people engaged in family building so actively, and because they often chose to do it in public, using the institutions that white people set up to govern marriage and family, Black families were visible in Massachusetts in a way that they were not in much of the rest of the kind of British Atlantic world. Therefore, as Boston's white community encountered Black activists' demand for the end of slavery in order to preserve family integrity, they must have actually thought of Black families struggling against the forces of slavery that threatened to tear them apart. These were families they knew, intact.
Car on the way here. He'll be here in a few minutes. And I told Wilma and her sister Wilma was here. She's out for it.
I'm sorry. Can you please mute your? Thank you. Sorry, Gloria. Go ahead.
No worries. So Boston's white community, because they were constantly encountering these Black families. When they kind of encountered Black activists' demands for the end of slavery in order to preserve family integrity, this wasn't like an abstract concept. The white community white individuals in the community would have certainly thought of Black families who were struggling against the forces of slavery that threatened to tear them apart. So families they knew, intact families, bound people who occupied the pews in their churches, who had taken care to build kin ties, formal ties often, with one another. So this claim that enslaved people should have a right to family autonomy made sense to white Bostonians in a way because they had long watched Black people build these family ties under the constraints of slavery. Husbands and wives ordinarily lived in separate households in New England. Children could be given away, as Darby had been as a child. Any family member could be sold out of town, and yet enslaved people continued to broadcast their bids for family unity to their communities. They asked their ministers to announce their marriage intentions. They approached local justices of the peace and other officials. They stood before their congregations and held up their infants for baptism. They sought advocates in their communities. They purchased their children's freedom. They sued for their wives' liberty in the courts. So Belonging tells this big story, the story of the sustained and often public struggle on the part of Black New Englanders for intimacy. Throughout the century and a half from New England's founding to the American Revolution, the enslaved strove to influence the treatment of their family members. They pursued opportunities for economic advancement. They called for release from bondage. Sometimes Black New Englanders secured meaningful concessions: the right to marry, protection for a child, a promise of freedom, and the cumulative effect of these concessions was significant. The work of making and maintaining kin ties over the generations influenced the region's law, religion, society, and politics. This work led to the legal protection of enslaved people's right to marry, for instance. It also helped foster uneasiness in the church about spousal separations. Ultimately, the actions taken by people of African descent to fortify their splintered families and the arguments made in turn by Black activists played a pivotal role in bringing about the collapse of slavery in Massachusetts. This book tells that larger narrative through a series of personal stories, pulling together these microhistories to demonstrate their cumulative effect in encouraging change in New England society That larger narrative and those intimate stories help explain how Darby could just march out of slavery in 1775. Jeremy Belknap, the early historian who sought to grasp how slavery had ended in Massachusetts, concluded that by the time of the Revolution, the public opinion was strongly in the favor of the abolition of slavery. When 6-year-old Darby deserted his owner's household to rejoin his birth family 3 towns away, he clearly sensed the change in public opinion, the recognition on the part of many white people that slavery was no longer defensible, in large part because it encroached upon the right of bondspeople to family integrity. Perhaps not surprisingly, Darby better understood his circumstances than the historians who followed him. The story of his walk out of slavery and his confrontation with the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, a story that once struck me as wildly improbable, well, it makes good sense when one takes care to explore its context and the history of slavery and family that came before it. In fact, this story, Darby's story, better follows the course of emancipation in Massachusetts than the conventional narrative of abolition does. Darby's walk followed an aggressive campaign waged by the enslaved to malign slavery for the handicaps it placed on families. This campaign was built upon generations of faithful family building on the part of the enslaved. Since the mid-17th century, Black people in Boston and the surrounding area had been marrying, bearing children, and agitating in support of their intimate bonds. They did this in their churches. They did it in court. They did it on the streets. The enslaved were the architects of their emancipation, and that they made the conflict between slavery and family visible by working diligently to form kin ties in public and to demand protection for their intimacies. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. What a fascinating presentation. I let everyone help me say, Gloria, thank you so much. Now we will move on to the Q&A questions. So I encourage anyone that have any questions for Miss Gloria. She'll pull the questions from out the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will call upon you. Great job, Gloria. Fascinating. I do see Miss Barbara Brown, Dr. Brown. Did you have a question for Miss Gloria? You're muted, Dr. Brown.
Sorry. I have a question and then some information from Brookline.
Wonderful.
The question is, of the 1,000 enslaved people who married in Boston in the 18th century, what percentage roughly of the whole enslaved population of Boston was it?
Yeah, so it was a small it was a significant minority of the population. I mean, there were I should have brought my book with me. I have a place where I kind of go through the demographics of the population of Black people in Boston over time. And of course, you've got it. I can ask you. So the Black population in Boston over time understandably fluctuated a great deal. And one thing I haven't done is try to come up with how many Black people would have lived in Boston over the course of the entire 18th century. There's not really the kind of data that would allow me to really answer that with specificity. But there were many times, these marriages that I'm talking about, and not all the marriage records are complete. So there's also lost marriages. There's an example of this is there's a chapter that I talk about marriages primarily in my book. It's the third chapter. The second chapter talks about how there were a huge number also of enslaved people and free Black people who went about going through the process to formally lodge their intentions to marry, because there was sort of a two-step process that couples who wished to marry would do something called post bans, and they would sort of announce that they were going to marry. They would come and formally inform the community that the marriage was coming, and this had to be done 3 times, and it was usually done from the pulpit. So there was a lot of couples who went through that step, but there's no marriage record for them. So that to me, I don't actually have a definitive answer to that, why that would be, but it suggests that marriage records could be incomplete, or it suggests that one of the most powerful things that particularly enslaved people found about marrying was this very formal public process where they were paraded in front of their entire congregations. And the most formal process was actually, or the most public process was the long process leading up to the marriage. And the marriage itself was not necessarily as public. The entire congregation wasn't necessarily present. So it's possible that some enslaved people thought, well, let's go through this process of getting these marriage intentions filed. Everyone will come to recognize us as married, but then let's not have to pay like the fee to to lodge our marriage record in the court, etc. So all that to say, is there even more marriage intentions than marriages? In this little talk, I just talked about the marriages, but there's another very large body of intentions to marry that were filed. Even the marriages plus the intentions are still, most Black people who lived in Boston, the majority of them did not go through this formal process. So I don't want to make it seem as if every single person who was enslaved in Boston was going through this. I mean, there were a whole sequence of hoops one needed to jump through. But the fact that thousands of these people were being, paraded in front of their churches, and the ministers were making these announcements, and justices of the peace were engaging with them, does suggest that Black people's marriages were particularly public in this time and place. And I think that is significant to the kinds of arguments that these activists were able to make in the revolutionary moment to an audience who had, all these people had grown up in the pews since they were, all these white neighbors had grown up in the pews since they were 5 years old, watching Black couples kind of and their commitments being announced to the churches. So I'm sorry I don't have more specifics.
What you've done is great, because it contextualizes it even more, which you've done your whole talk, and your book is brilliant. I haven't finished it, but it's so revealing. Now I want to tell you about Brookline, and you can find some of this data on our website, Hidden Brookline.
Great.
But I've just went back and read it, and there's some errors in it. There were
happens to all of us.
There were between 80 and 90 enslaved people in Brookline, almost all in the 18th century. There were 2 marriages, and in those 2 marriages, there were 5 children. And there were also at least 4 free people in Brookline, mostly in the early 18th century. And of the 5 people, one of the children became of age and married also in the church in Brookline. And he and his wife then moved to Dorchester. And he died when he was in his 80s. And it's like, wow. So that's just a piece of local history.
Thank you. Thank you for that local history. I do believe a couple tidbits about Brookline in the book, but
I saw them.
Okay, but you are the expert there, so I appreciate that, and I will check out the information you have online. Wow, there are so many questions that have come in. Okay, just the most recent one, because I see it. Jenny Grinnell asks, you mentioned probate, petitions, court, and newspapers as sources for your research. What other record groups were helpful for you to uncover the Black activism that worked so well on public opinion? That's a great question, Jenny. I think that this piece about Black activism, I was able to locate more. I was able to, in terms of these kinds of treatises that were being written, these petitions, these letters that were circulating, being printed, being advertised in newspapers that were, being passed hand by hand down the street in these urban places. Really, the moment I talk about, the revolutionary moment, is where you see that happening. And then in earlier moments, I would just say that Black activism sort of took different forms in terms of what remains in the archive. And so I am, constrained by what I can find. But I did work very extensively with probate records, as mentioned. And, even like a record like probate records, they're very hard records to work with because there's not, they don't ordinarily show Black people as actors, they show Black people as property. And, they're ugly sources in a lot of ways, reading through and seeing the way people are being cataloged and described. And, the Black man is written on the same line as the swine, when the assessor is out in the, appraising what's in the barn. I mean, they're really ugly sources, but they do reveal a lot. And there are moments where you can actually see, where you do see the agency of these people shining through. So moments, for instance, where some people are liberated in wills, and in those wills, sometimes the liberator, the person who's deceased, the white person, will talk about why the actions that the enslaved person had taken that had persuaded the enslaver that this person really should be at liberty and not be held in bondage any longer. Or you can see these tidbits. I think of one inventory that I could give a whole talk just on this, but one inventory, and there's a little scribble in the corner that says, there's I promised, Jenny's mother that I would free her. So kind of like, don't count her in the value of, or she shouldn't be. Jenny's mother was given a promise that she should be freed, so she shouldn't be counted in the value of these possessions, or things like that, where you can see Jenny's mother was an active agent and working hard to get her daughter's liberty. So even those ugly sources that often feel like just bad news sources can show moments where people were really courageous and made a lot of really difficult, were in very difficult situations, but made the most of them, and were sometimes able to have great success.
Those inventories, sorry, I was just going to say, inventories are also helpful in a way for reconstructing families based on how they're listed, which I agree is completely disturbing to have, people, enumerated basically in an inventory along with other kinds of property. But they are, once you get over that shock and kind of disgust, they're very helpful records.
Absolutely. I think the disgust is real, and good to kind of like hold with us as we look at them, but the kinds of insight into family life can really be impressive. And honestly, there are some Black people who had inventories, and then you can learn about free Black people. You can learn about other contours of the community, but some other kinds of sources that I love historical sources, so I could just go on and on. So I need to rein myself in. But a few other kinds that I found really useful are records of town officials. So like town selectmen, or the what they call like the town scavenger, who basically was in charge of the town lost and found system, or all these kind of local, constables, overseers of the poor. So these kind of low level town officials. Certainly church records are very useful, private papers, people's letters and diaries. But one hard thing that I'm sure many of you have confronted is that, sometimes people ask me, what sources are really, what sources are the best sources for your research? And honestly, I feel like I've had to look at every kind of source that exists, and everything is a tiny bit helpful and nothing is very helpful. Right. And it's just like, you've got to go through everything and you find these little shards and then try to arrange them in a way so that the mosaic, makes sense. It's like putting a puzzle together.
A lot of
Thank you.
information.
Can I comment on something, Gloria? I just want to pick up on Mike Petoskey's comment that he had. Would you comment
please.
would you comment on the impression that the majority of congregational ministers are slave owners or were slave owners? And I say that because this past Sunday I attended a service at King's Chapel who acknowledged the number of parishioners and pastors who have had, ties to slaves. So I commend them for that. And I thought it was very relevant given that particular event that took place. But anyway, that's and Mike usually has some very good comments anyway.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. Sorry, so many great comments. I feel like I'm going to have to read this after to digest all the stuff coming in. Mike, you're right that most of the congregational ministers were slaveholders. Partly, congregational ministers were part of the more elite in the society, and most of the people with wealth owned enslaved people in this time. So we could have a whole other talk or a whole other books about how that could be. There's a lot of tension there. But yes, you are absolutely right that the majority of congregational ministers were slaveholders. I see this came up. Any research done to locate living descendants in the book? Great question. That's from Sharon Stiles. Thank you, Sharon. I did some research, so I got in touch with obviously Dennis in Egypt, and a lot of their extended family members are the descendants of Darby Vassal, who is somebody I obviously think very highly, having named that scholarship fund after him. I've been in touch with some descendants of the family of Chapter 4. The surname of the man was Baduna. It's about a man named Thomas Baduna, who was a Black man and had an interracial marriage. He formally married a white woman in Boston in the early part of the very early part of the 18th century, and then raised a whole family together, and his children then raised their children. Most of them, so far as I can tell, eventually passed for white in the community, but that chapter is sort of about what did family look like when it crossed racial boundaries. And unfortunately, for several of my chapters, the enslaved people I write about didn't have surnames. And it's very hard to trace I guess the answer is I haven't been able to trace I haven't been able to find direct lines to people living today for the subjects of chapters 1, 2, 3, or 5. So only for 2 of my families have I been able to connect to descendants. But I am certainly would love to be able to continue that work. Let's see. I see Karima Lewis, or are there any hands up that I'm missing?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Gloria, I will let
Hi,
Mrs.
yes.
Bertha Jackman, she had her hand up. I'll let you go ahead and ask question to Ms. Wyden as we are winding in on a few minutes left in the meeting today.
Thanks, Bertha.
Hi. Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you. This is fascinating. I'm calling from Pennsylvania. And so my question is, this kind of Black activism, was it only possible in New England, or did it happen any other place before the Revolutionary War?
Great question, Bertha. So this Black activism, I think, happened earliest and in the most powerful way in the Boston and the greater Boston area for a couple of reasons. One was Boston was the most printed place in the Americas, probably the most printed place of anywhere outside of London in this moment. Boston was a huge center of print culture. So there were printers all over the place, printing pamphlets, newspapers, etc. Of course, Pennsylvania had a strong print culture as well, though not as many newspapers and printers as Boston. But Pennsylvania certainly had printed material too. But so Boston was this important center of print culture, and it was sort of the most radical place of revolutionary conflict between the local people and the British. And so part of what's going on here, and I couldn't get into everything, but this is all taking place in the backdrop of this, revolution. And so people are thinking a lot about freedom and liberty and what does that mean? And sort of there's a lot of radicalism on the street in Boston in this particular moment. And then Boston also had this very visible history of these enslaved families kind of living out their lives and making their demands in public. So for all of those reasons, Boston, I think, had a sort of special moment of activism in these years. But there are echoes of what happened in places like Philadelphia. So I can't speak with as much authority on that as the Boston piece, because I've just spent years immersed in these sources in New England. And so I don't think you wouldn't find the same kind of scale of Black activism in this particular moment in Philadelphia, but there absolutely was a degree of this kind of activity.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you. We for everyone for attending our first time. We do keep our meetings at an hour to be respectful of everyone's time. Gloria, your presentation was fascinating. We applaud you. We thank you for sharing your time with us today. For anyone that joined the meeting late or wanted to recap our meetings today, we do record our meetings and they will be uploaded. This meeting will be uploaded to our Slave Legacy History Coalition YouTube channel. The link is in the chat. And we also have more information on our website if you have not been able to see it at www.slavelegacyhistorycoalition.org. If you would like to be a presenter, or if you know anyone that would like to present at the Slave Legacy History Coalition, please get in touch with us via our website, and we would love to get back in contact with you. Gloria, again, thank you, my friend, for sharing your time with us. Thank you for your book, which is also on our website too as well for purchase and on our newsletter. But thank you, Gloria, and everyone. Let's give Gloria a wonderful applause for a great presentation. Dad, do you want to say anything before we leave?
I do very quickly. Again, yes, thank you very much, Gloria, and we'll be in touch. We appreciate it. Gloria did mention the proceeds from the book would go to the Darby Vassal Scholarship Fund. And so we encourage you to certainly not only buy the book for its content, but to help support the scholarship effort. I did want to ask, I wanted to just recognize, again, our Reverend Joy Folan. And the interesting thing about history is that King's Chapel, as you may or may not know, is the oldest church in America. And of which Reverend Joy, I saw her on our attendees today, is the rector, and she actually is spearheading the groundbreaking and blessing ceremony that they had on Sunday for the installment of a statue commemorating enslavement in Boston. So that's certainly a monumental step. And finally, Miss Bertha Jackman, I'm sorry, could you put your email in the text here so we can reach out to you? Pennsylvania is, nice area. So we like to make sure we reach out to people down there. And one final point, like Egypt mentioned, if you have announcements, please send them to our, you have Naomi Gordon, who coordinates our information and on our website. And finally, well, thank you. And we appreciate all you've done today, Gloria and Egypt.
All right.
Thank
You,
you.
Des. Thank you, Gloria. We look forward to seeing you guys again at our next meeting, which will be in September. And thank you again, Gloria. And I hope you all have a great week, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye now.